Peter had always dreamed of a life filled with luxury. He wasn't born into wealth, but he had learned early on that the world operated on status and connections. When he met Emma, the beautiful daughter of a wealthy businessman, he saw the perfect opportunity. She was kind, intelligent, and everything he had ever wanted, on the surface. They had met at a party, where he charmed her with his wit and confidence. Soon enough, the proposal came, and the lavish engagement rings sparkled under the lights of her family's estate. Peter felt like his life was about to change for the better. The wedding was a grand affair. A 5-star venue, endless champagne, and a guest list filled with influential people from all over the world. Peter couldn't believe his luck. His friends envied him, and his family couldn't stop bragging about his new life. But as they settled into their new home, something began to shift. Emma, who once seemed so warm and loving, started to grow cold. She was often distant, absorbed in her own world, and her interactions with Peter began to feel rehearsed. The man who had married her for wealth now found himself questioning the cost of that wealth. At first, Peter dismissed it, convincing himself that the occasional distance was just a phase. He told himself that the beautiful home, the vacations, and the sense of security were worth a little emotional neglect. But as days turned into months and months into years, Peter began to realize how empty his life had become. The love he had once felt for Emma was now overshadowed by frustration and loneliness. Yet he clung to the illusion of wealth, convinced that if he just endured, it would all be worth it. Emma's emotional distance only deepened. She seemed to withdraw further into herself, leaving Peter to navigate their marriage alone. Whenever Peter tried to engage her in conversation, she would brush him off with a half-hearted response. It wasn't just a lack of affection, it was an indifference that stung more than anything. Their once passionate discussions about their future were replaced with awkward silences and bitter arguments. Peter would often find himself questioning why he had chosen this life, but the promise of security, of luxury, kept him tethered. As Emma grew more distant, Peter became more desperate to fix things. He tried to surprise her with gifts, plan elaborate dates, and even took up new hobbies in an effort to rekindle the spark they had once shared. But no matter what he did, Emma seemed unimpressed, as though nothing could break through her emotional wall. She had everything she could ever want: a beautiful home, a successful husband, and a life of opulence. Yet, it was as if none of it mattered to her. She had become a stranger, and Peter was left chasing an illusion he no longer understood. The stress of his failing marriage began to take a toll on Peter. He found himself withdrawing, spending more time at the office or out with friends. It wasn't that he didn't love Emma. He did, in a way. But he had started to wonder if their love had ever been real, or if it was just a convenient transaction. The weight of this realization crushed him. He had built his entire life around this image of perfection, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was suffocating in a gilded cage. The first major argument came on the anniversary of their marriage. Peter had gone out of his way to plan a surprise dinner at their favorite restaurant, one they had visited on their first date. It was supposed to be special, a chance to reconnect after months of emotional distance. But when Emma arrived, she seemed indifferent. She barely acknowledged the effort Peter had put into the evening. When he confronted her, asking what was wrong, she snapped, accusing him of being selfish and obsessed with material things. Peter's heart sank. The woman he had married seemed like a completely different person now. This wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with, the one who had been warm, caring, and full of life. This version of Emma was cold, angry, and dismissive. The more they fought, the clearer it became to Peter that his marriage had become a facade. Emma didn't need him for love. She needed him to maintain her lifestyle. And that realization hit Peter harder than anything else. The idea that he had married her for the wrong reasons finally set in, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. That night, Peter made a decision. He would start working on himself. He couldn't change Emma, but he could change how he responded to her. He needed to find his own happiness, separate from the wealth that had once seemed so important. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but Peter knew he couldn't continue living a life dictated by the pursuit of luxury. He began by distancing himself emotionally from Emma and focusing on rebuilding his own identity, something he had neglected for years. Peter's journey towards self-improvement wasn't easy. At first, he felt lost. He had spent so many years defining his worth by Emma's wealth that he didn't know who he was without it. He began by reconnecting with old friends who had known him before the riches, before the mansion, and before the constant pressure to be someone he wasn't. They reminded him of the man he had once been, a man full of dreams and ambitions that had nothing to do with money. Over time, Peter found joy in simple things. Long walks in the park, reading books he had long forgotten, and cooking meals from scratch. He started exercising, rediscovered his love for painting, and began to take pride in small accomplishments. Slowly, he began to feel like himself again, and it was liberating. The more Peter focused on his own growth, the less he relied on the wealth that had once seemed so essential. His marriage, however, remained unchanged. Emma still treated him with indifference, and the emotional abuse continued. But Peter had stopped depending on Emma's validation. He had learned to love himself, and that was enough. He was no longer seeking approval from a woman who couldn't give it. He wasn't going to stay in the marriage just for the luxuries, but something held him back. He still had hope that maybe, just maybe, Emma would change. Perhaps she too would come to realize that wealth wasn't everything, and that love, true love, could still save them. One evening, as Peter returned home from a weekend retreat he had taken to reflect on his life, he found Emma waiting for him. Her face was pale, and she looked shaken. Without the usual air of superiority or distance, Emma finally spoke. She had been hiding something for years, something that had been eating away at her. As Peter listened, Emma revealed a secret about her family. Her father's wealth had come at a terrible cost. He had been involved in illegal dealings that had led to several deaths, and Emma had been complicit in covering it up. The guilt had weighed heavily on her for years, and the burden of maintaining the perfect image had taken its toll. Peter was stunned. The woman he had married, the cold, distant woman, had been carrying a secret so dark that it explained much of her behavior. The emotional abuse, the manipulation, the controlling nature, it all made sense now. Emma had been trapped in her own guilt, unable to connect with anyone because she was haunted by the choices her family had made. But the revelation left Peter in turmoil. He didn't know if he could ever trust her again, and yet he understood her pain. The life they had built, the wealth he had once coveted, suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of such a heavy truth. As Peter processed this new information, he was faced with a decision. Could he forgive Emma for the secrets she had kept from him? Could their marriage ever be salvaged after everything they had been through? Peter knew he couldn't answer these questions right away. But as he looked into Emma's eyes, he realized that the path forward wasn't clear. The wealth, the status, the luxury, all of it had been a mask, an illusion. And now the real work of rebuilding a life, a marriage, and a future began. The days following Emma's revelation were a blur. Peter couldn't seem to grasp the full scope of what Emma had shared. Her family's illegal dealings, her involvement in covering up the past, it was too much to process all at once. He had always believed that their problems were rooted in emotional neglect, but this was something far deeper. Emma wasn't just emotionally distant. She had been hiding a web of deceit, and Peter had been unknowingly living in the shadow of that deception. At first, Peter tried to approach Emma with empathy. He wanted to understand her, to get to the root of the pain that had caused her to become the person she was. But every time he reached out, she recoiled. The walls she had built around herself were thick, fortified by guilt and fear. Despite his efforts, she would avoid the conversation, leaving Peter feeling helpless. He had spent so many years trying to earn her affection, trying to make their marriage work, but now he faced the uncomfortable reality that their relationship had been built on a lie. The wealth, the luxury, the perfect life, none of it had been real. And the truth was much harder to face. Peter knew he couldn't move forward without understanding the full extent of Emma's past. He pushed her to open up, and eventually, she confessed to him that her father's criminal empire had ruined countless lives. She explained how, as a child, she had been forced to turn a blind eye to the crimes her father committed, knowing that speaking out would destroy everything she had known. Her mother had demanded that she remain silent, and her sense of loyalty to her family had clouded her ability to love and trust anyone. This guilt had festered inside her, and it had poisoned their marriage. Peter realized that Emma wasn't just emotionally distant. She was trapped by the weight of her own decisions. After hearing Emma's confession, Peter was torn. He had been angry, frustrated, and confused for so long, but now he understood that Emma had been a victim of her circumstances just as much as he had. Her emotional neglect wasn't just a personal failing. It was a coping mechanism, a defense against the overwhelming guilt she had carried for years. Yet, despite understanding the complexity of her pain, Peter couldn't ignore the way her actions had affected him. He had tried to live a life of illusion, convinced that wealth and comfort would make everything better. But now that he saw the true cost of their marriage, he didn't know if he could continue living in this world of deceit. Peter spent several days reflecting on his options. Could he forgive Emma? Could he stay with her, knowing the kind of woman she had become because of her past? Or would it be better for both of them to go their separate ways? He realized that the only way to move forward was to let go of the illusion of wealth and everything it represented. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about whether they could build a future based on truth, trust, and genuine love. But even that seemed impossible. Could he ever truly trust Emma again, after everything that had been revealed? And if he stayed, how could he escape the shadow of her family's sins? Peter decided to confront Emma one last time. They sat in their living room, the once beautiful space now feeling suffocating. "I need to know if you're willing to change," Peter said softly. "Can you let go of your family's legacy and stop hiding behind it? Can we rebuild something real, something based on honesty, not this mask of wealth and power?" Emma looked at him. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in a long while, Peter saw vulnerability. "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've spent my entire life protecting myself from the truth. But I want to try for you. I want to be the woman you married, the one you thought you knew. I just need time." Peter took her hand, but the weight of her words hung heavily between them. Time. Was that all they had left? Over the next few weeks, Peter and Emma tried to rebuild their relationship. They sought couples therapy, though Emma was hesitant at first. Peter had learned to set boundaries, distancing himself emotionally when Emma became too defensive or closed off. He realized that healing would take time, and he couldn't rush it. In the meantime, he focused on his own personal growth. He continued to pursue his passions, spending more time with his friends and rediscovering parts of himself that had been neglected for so long. The more he worked on himself, the clearer it became that he was no longer the same man who had married Emma for her wealth. He was stronger, more self-assured, and less dependent on external validation. Emma, too, seemed to be making strides. She attended therapy on her own, facing the demons of her past and learning how to let go of the guilt that had defined her. She slowly opened up about her childhood, the pressure of growing up in a family whose wealth was built on lies, and the isolation she had felt because of it. Peter could see that she was trying, but it wasn't enough. The scars of her past were too deep, and though she had begun the process of healing, the emotional damage couldn't be undone overnight. As time passed, Peter began to wonder if they could ever truly move past the hurt. Emma had made progress, but he had changed too. He no longer saw their marriage through the lens of wealth or social status. He saw it as a partnership, a shared journey. But even then, doubts crept in. He was no longer willing to stay in a relationship for the sake of comfort, for the sake of appearances. Emma's past, her secrets, had created cracks in their foundation, and Peter wondered if they could ever fully repair them. One evening, just as Peter was starting to believe that Emma was truly trying to change, an unexpected phone call shattered everything. It was from an old business associate of Emma's father, someone Peter had never met but had heard stories about. The man on the other end of the line was urgent, his voice trembling. "I know what you've been through, Peter. I don't want to cause more pain, but you need to know the truth. Emma didn't just cover up her father's crimes. She was involved in more than you realize. She may have been an unwilling participant, but she knew about the extent of his operations." The call ended abruptly, leaving Peter speechless. Was this another attempt to manipulate him? Or had Emma been hiding even more from him? The truth was more complicated than he had imagined, and now Peter was left facing a new, even darker truth. Emma had always been a victim, but how much of her involvement in her father's empire had been voluntary? And what did that mean for their future? Peter sat in silence, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he realized that the answers he had been searching for might not set him free. Instead, they could trap him in a world far darker than the one he had ever imagined, revealing more secrets about Emma's past than he had ever imagined. He didn't know who to believe anymore, Emma or the mysterious caller. His trust in her had already been shattered, but now he faced a new dilemma. Did he confront her with what he had learned, knowing it could destroy everything they had tried to rebuild? Or did he walk away, leaving the past and the secrets behind him for good? As he sat on the balcony, staring out at the city skyline, Peter knew one thing for certain. The illusion of wealth had long since faded. But could he still hold on to the hope of love? Or was he destined to live in the shadow of Emma's past forever? The choice was his, but it was one he didn't feel ready to make. And so the question lingered. Would Peter walk away, or would he risk it all for one last chance at love and redemption? Peter couldn't sleep that night. The phone call, though cryptic, had made his mind spin. Emma had always been a victim of her family's sins, or at least, that's what he had convinced himself. But now, the possibility that she had known more than she let on made everything feel like a lie. As dawn broke, Peter found himself standing by the window, staring out at the world that seemed so unchanged, even as his entire life was beginning to unravel. Emma came into the room, her usual graceful demeanor replaced by an air of uncertainty. Peter turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for the truth. "I need you to tell me everything," Peter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know about your father's operations? Were you involved in all of it?" Emma's face paled, her eyes flickering with panic. She opened her mouth, then closed it, as if she were searching for the right words. The silence between them thickened, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice trembling. I knew things I shouldn't have, things I wish I could forget. But I was just a child, Peter. I didn't have a choice." Her confession hung in the air, heavier than any of the wealth they had accumulated together. Peter's heart broke, not just because of the betrayal, but because he could see the hurt in Emma's eyes. She wasn't the villain in her own story. She was a casualty, a product of a world she never asked for. But even knowing this didn't make it easier to accept. Peter stood frozen, the weight of her admission pressing down on him. The conversation didn't end there. Emma poured out the rest of her soul, recounting her family's rise to power, the corruption, and the fear that had kept her silent for so long. She described how her father had threatened not just her, but her entire family, forcing her to live in constant terror. Emma confessed that she had been afraid to speak out, afraid to lose everything she knew, including the love of her mother, who turned a blind eye to her father's dealings. She had lived her entire life feeling trapped, with no escape from the legacy of her father's empire. Peter listened, his heart heavy with a mix of anger and compassion. He could understand the fear, but he struggled to reconcile the woman who had once promised him love and the woman sitting before him, tangled in guilt and hidden truths. He couldn't help but wonder. If Emma had been more forthcoming from the start, would things have been different? But the past was irreparable, and now Peter was left trying to understand where they went from here. The luxurious life, once so desirable, now felt like a prison. The mansion, the cars, the parties. It all seemed meaningless against the backdrop of Emma's painful past. Could he forgive her? Was it possible to love her when everything she had told him felt like a lie? But then, as if reading his thoughts, Emma reached out to him, her hand trembling. "Peter," she said softly, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to stay. But I want you to know that I'm not that person anymore. I've been working on myself. I'm trying to be better. For both of us." Peter didn't know what to say. He didn't know if he was ready to believe her, but he also didn't know if he was ready to give up on the woman he had once loved. He needed time to think, to process everything. Peter spent the following days in a haze of confusion. He couldn't ignore the gravity of Emma's revelations, nor could he shake the feeling that everything they had built together was tainted. He didn't know if he could ever trust her again, but the thought of walking away from the life they had built together left him hollow. Peter found himself revisiting their old memories, the laughter they had shared, the dreams they had discussed, the times when everything seemed so perfect. But those memories were now clouded by the weight of the secrets that had been hidden from him for so long. In an effort to find clarity, Peter sought out an old friend, a former colleague who had once worked closely with Emma's father. Over coffee, Peter asked about the family's past, about the true nature of Emma's involvement. His friend was reluctant to speak, but after some coaxing, he admitted that Emma had been more complicit than she had let on. She may not have pulled the trigger, but she knew about everything. She saw the deals, she knew the consequences. And she stayed silent. "She allowed it all to happen, Peter," he said, his words striking Peter like a slap in the face. The truth was more painful than he had imagined. Peter returned home that night, his mind reeling. The betrayal, the deceit, it was more than he could bear. But as he sat in the silence of the house, he realized that he wasn't just angry with Emma. He was angry at himself for choosing this life, for letting himself be swept away by the illusion of wealth and security. He had sacrificed his happiness for a lie, and now he was paying the price. As the weight of this realization settled in, Peter knew that something had to change. The life they were leading was unsustainable, and he couldn't keep living in the shadow of Emma's past. The weeks that followed were a blur of painful conversations and emotional distance. Emma, despite her attempts to reconcile with Peter, seemed lost in her own guilt, retreating further into herself as the walls between them grew higher. Peter, meanwhile, felt increasingly disconnected from the woman he had married. The love that had once seemed so certain now felt like a distant memory, replaced by mistrust and regret. One night, after another argument about the past, Peter reached his breaking point. He stood in their lavish living room, his hands clenched at his sides, and told Emma that he couldn't do it anymore. "I've tried, Emma. I've tried to love you, to forgive you. But this life we're leading, it's not real. I can't keep pretending that it's all okay when it's not. I'm suffocating here, and I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Emma's face fell, and for a moment, Peter saw something in her eyes, a flicker of hope. She was willing to fight for them, but Peter wasn't sure if he could anymore. "I'm sorry, Peter," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to undo the damage I've done. But I need you to know that I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right." Peter closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He had loved her once, and part of him still did. But he couldn't keep holding on to something that had already shattered. "I can't stay in this marriage anymore, Emma. It's not healthy for either of us. We need to heal, separately." The finality of his words hit Emma like a freight train, but there was nothing she could say to change his mind. Peter had made his choice, and as he walked out of the door, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with sadness. He had given everything to a woman who could never fully give herself to him, and now it was time to move on. In the weeks that followed, Peter focused on rebuilding his life. He moved out of the mansion and into a modest apartment, where he could finally find some peace and solitude. He spent his days working on himself, picking up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by deceit and regret. Slowly, he found a sense of balance, a newfound appreciation for the simple things in life. But despite the calm in his personal life, the storm was far from over. As the divorce proceedings began, Emma revealed a bombshell that would change everything. She had uncovered a dark family secret, a secret so powerful that it could alter the trajectory of Peter's future. Emma had been keeping it hidden, but now, with nothing left to lose, she decided it was time to reveal the truth. And Peter, still reeling from the years of deception, was left to wonder what the future would hold. Peter had been trying to move forward with his life. He had found some sense of peace in his small apartment, though his thoughts were often clouded by memories of Emma and their broken marriage. He had thrown himself into his work, making strides in his career, and even made a few new friends along the way. But as his life seemed to settle into a new normal, Emma reached out to him again. This time, not with pleas to reconcile, but with something far more unsettling. The phone rang late one evening while Peter was reading a book. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Emma's name flash across the screen. He hesitated before answering, unsure of what kind of conversation he would be walking into this time. "Peter," Emma's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made his skin prickle. "There's something I need to tell you. Something you won't believe, but it's the truth." Peter sat up straighter, his instincts telling him this wasn't just another apology. "What is it, Emma?" he asked, his voice guarded. Emma paused for a long time before continuing, as if she were trying to find the right words. "Your family. They're involved in my father's operations. Your uncle, specifically. I didn't want to tell you this before, but I can't live with the guilt of keeping it from you any longer." Peter felt his stomach drop. His mind raced, trying to process what Emma had just said. His family? He had never even suspected any involvement. "You're telling me my uncle was part of your father's criminal dealings?" Peter's voice was barely a whisper, as if he were trying to grasp the weight of her words. Emma's voice cracked slightly. "I wish I could say it wasn't true, but it is. Your uncle was a major player in some of the illegal operations that my father ran. And I've seen him at meetings, planning, dealing. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw it with my own eyes. And I think that's why your family kept pushing for you and me to stay together. They knew what was at stake." Peter's mind reeled. This wasn't just a revelation about Emma's past. It was about his own. His family, the very ones he had trusted and relied on, were entangled in the web of deception he had spent so long escaping. How could he have been so blind? Was his whole life a lie? The revelation about his uncle left Peter reeling. For days, he couldn't shake the images Emma had painted of his family. His once beloved uncle, a key figure in a criminal empire he had never even suspected. Peter went through the motions of his daily life, but his mind was consumed by the idea that everything he thought he knew about his past might have been built on lies. The wealth, the family legacy, everything seemed tainted by the truth Emma had uncovered. He tried reaching out to his uncle, but the calls went unanswered. Peter knew that if what Emma said was true, then his uncle was likely involved in something dangerous, and he had no idea just how far the web of corruption reached. He spent hours researching his family's business dealings, trying to connect the dots, but every lead seemed to get more and more convoluted. The more he uncovered, the more it seemed like his entire life had been a carefully orchestrated illusion. Peter had always believed that his marriage to Emma had been a product of her family's wealth and influence. He had assumed they used him, manipulated him into marrying her for their own benefit. But now, he realized that his own family had been playing a role in the drama too. Everything he had once believed about who he was, and why he had made certain choices, seemed to crumble beneath the weight of the truth. Peter's work began to suffer. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the distraction, the constant worry in his eyes. He tried to focus, but his thoughts kept circling back to Emma's words. He was no longer sure what the truth was, or who he could trust. The wealthy life he had been drawn into, the one he thought would give him everything, had come with a price. One that was far steeper than he had ever imagined. The truth about his family's involvement in Emma's father's empire gnawed at Peter like a festering wound. He couldn't let it go. The more he learned, the more disgusted he became with the legacy he had inherited. He had worked so hard to distance himself from Emma's world, only to find out that his own family had been part of the same corrupt system. Peter couldn't let this go unanswered. He had to confront his uncle, to understand the depths of the family's involvement. But there was another problem. Emma had said that his family had known all along about his marriage to her, and had pushed for it for reasons he hadn't fully understood. Was he just a pawn in their game, or was there something even darker at play? He couldn't shake the feeling that his family had always known about Emma's father's operations, and had used his marriage to gain leverage in the larger scheme of things. Peter spent days digging through old financial records, connecting names to businesses, and searching for any evidence that would expose the full extent of the corruption. The more he uncovered, the more his suspicions grew. His family wasn't just complicit, they were active participants. They had been manipulating him all along, pulling the strings behind the scenes, controlling his every move. But as Peter neared the truth, he realized just how dangerous it could be to expose it. If his uncle and the rest of the family were as deeply involved as he suspected, then revealing everything could come at a steep cost. Peter was no longer just fighting for his marriage or his future. He was fighting for his life. Peter spent sleepless nights wrestling with what he had discovered. The weight of his family's betrayal, the endless lies, and the shattered trust with Emma felt unbearable. His world had turned upside down, and he realized that he had no one left to turn to. The friends he had once trusted were now distant. The people he had once relied on were either involved in the corruption or unaware of it altogether. He was alone, and the truth had cost him everything. But there was one thing Peter still had, his own strength. Over the years, he had worked hard to build his own life, to distance himself from the toxic world of wealth and power. And now, with the truth before him, he had to decide whether to expose his family's crimes and risk everything, or to walk away and let it all go. As he sat at his desk, staring at the evidence he had gathered, Peter felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. He could no longer live in a world of illusion. He could no longer hide from the truth, no matter how painful it was. The only way forward was to expose everything, to bring justice to the people who had been hurt by his family's actions. But doing so would come at a cost that Peter wasn't sure he was ready to pay. As he picked up the phone, he realized that this decision would be the one that defined the rest of his life. Would he choose the truth, no matter the cost? Or would he allow the illusion to continue, knowing that he could never escape the shadow of his past? Peter dialed the number with a trembling hand. The person on the other end of the line answered after several rings. "Peter," the voice said, low and cautious, "are you sure about this? Once you take this step, there's no going back." Peter took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was it, the moment of truth. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. "I've spent too long pretending. It's time to face what's real." The voice on the other end sighed deeply, as if it knew the cost of what was about to unfold. "All right then, I'll help you expose them. But be careful, Peter. You don't know what you're getting into." As the conversation ended, Peter sat back in his chair, staring at the pile of evidence in front of him. He had made his choice. But as the weight of what he was about to do settled in, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, and his entire world would come crashing down. And so, with the truth now in his hands, Peter waited. What would happen next? Would his decision bring the justice he sought, or would it destroy everything he had left?